Alright, what's going on everybody? Welcome back to another video here on the channel, and today we're going to be talking about Cuba. There's a pretty important situation kind of unfolding, a political crisis. The island country has been struggling with a lot of different issues over the last about year and a half or so, and it's kind of unfolded to this point where mass protests have started in the country, and there's been like a very crazy situation going on, and I just kind of wanted to talk about it because what's going on there is pretty crazy, and this is stuff that we've seen before. It's not like this is some sort of unprecedented movement or anything going on in Cuba. This is actually the first time in decades that protests of this degree have unfolded in the country, but I mean, we have seen problems arise in plenty of other countries, but Cuba's kind of in a unique situation right now. There's been these massive protests against the government that have been starting in Cuba, and it's actually revolving around a couple of different issues. Now, one of the least, I guess, important in terms of like what the media will talk about it with is basic civil liberties have been kind of restricted on the island for a while now. If you didn't know, Cuba is actually a communist country. It is ran basically by a regime, even though they do actually call the leader of their country president and everything, but it's nothing like what you would expect, I guess, in like a Western country, right? One of the points that people were kind of upset about was the fact that artists were not allowed to basically, like if you had, let's say you were in a band or something, right? You could not perform in public or in private without prior permission from the government, basically. And so artist rights were kind of this, I guess, step that kind of led to all this. But what really actually started to lead to all of this were food shortages, the growing COVID-19 threat in the country, the lack of electricity, and basically the collapse of the economy. So Cuban citizens took to the streets across the country for the first time in more than 6 decades to protest against deteriorating living conditions and the lack of basic goods and services, including medical attention and the increasing numbers of coronavirus infections. The protests, with thousands of people calling for an end to the 62-year-old communist regime, began July 11th in the western city of San Antonio de los Baños, later spreading to more than 40 cities and towns, including the capital, Havana. President Miguel Diaz-Canel quickly deployed security forces across the country. His government disrupted communications with the state-run phone and network monopoly ETEXA, halting internet service. In Havana, state forces were sent out on July 11th, including so-called rapid reaction brigades and Communist Party militants armed with heavy sticks. Some protesters were attacked and more than 100 were arrested, according to activists. In subsequent days, hundreds of Cubans lined up outside police stations to look for missing relatives whose whereabouts were unknown. So the situation has gotten pretty dire on the island. Protesters are being arrested. There's even been reports that I've been reading where journalists were being stalked by armed figures, most likely headed by the government. There was even reports that journalists were being detained and arrested by security forces as well, simply for trying to report on what's going on. Of course, we just read that, well, let's see here. More than 100 people were arrested according to the activists, and the president has been deploying security forces across the country. So from my understanding of the situation, what's really been going on, especially recently, is obviously the pandemic kind of destroyed tourism last year, right? I mean, here in the US, we saw like cruise lines shut down, airports were emptied, right? Theme parks were shutting down, stadiums were pretty much closed, right? Like, we did not have crowds and sporting events and things like that for months. But Cuba is not entirely reliant on tourism, but a major sector of their economy is tourism to the island. And obviously, with the complete destruction, basically, of tourism during the pandemic, they ended up losing a lot of money, and an economic crisis is basically hitting the island now. There's reports I'm reading, people are standing hours in line just to get basic food and medical care. There's a lack of healthcare professionals and resources to actually treat people infected with COVID and, of course, with everything else. So the healthcare system in the country is completely strained right now. Inflation estimates that I read said that the island is grappling with 500% inflation estimates. And it's gotten so bad that Cuba's Interior Ministry said that one person had died when a group of protesters attacked a police station in a town near Havana, and that during the entire incident, multiple people were injured, including police. Now, good news, quote-unquote, in this entire thing is that obviously people are upset for these reasons, and the government made one step towards, I guess, addressing these concerns when Prime Minister Manuel Marrero announced that last week, goods that were brought to the island by visitors would no longer be subject to any customs duties, so people could leave the island, they could get food, drinks, medicine, get what they wanted and they could bring these things back to the island and not have to pay any sort of customs on them. The Cuban economy contracted more than 11% last year amid the pandemic, which led tourism to dry up and brought about a drop in remittances from Cubans living abroad, both vital sources of income for families. Cubans stand for hours in line to buy basic goods such as chicken or bread or even to take a bus. The island has been increasingly hit by hours-long electricity outages, and in recent weeks, coronavirus infections have surged, according to authorities, putting a strain on the country's health system. After suffering relatively few COVID-19 cases in 2020 and only 46 deaths, the island saw a pickup this year, with the curve steepening in April and more so in June. The government has reported close to 2,000 deaths so far. So COVID has completely, I guess, destroyed the island in multiple different ways. Not only are people actually getting the virus more now and dying from it more now, the hit to tourism shrunk the economy by a pretty significant percentage. I mean, 11% for your economy to contract in a given year, that's massive. That's a huge amount of the money on this island that is left due to multiple different circumstances, and now it's leading to this situation where people, just to get basic necessities to survive, have to wait hours. President Diaz-Canel said that the protests were being led by a minority of, quote, counter-revolutionaries sold out to the U.S. government taking advantage of the difficult situation in Cuba and the pandemic. He urged supporters of the regime to take back the streets from the demonstrators, which led to attacks on protesters. Soon after the unrest began, authorities cut off most communications with the outside world and deployed security forces across the country. Among those arrested were visual artist Luis Manuel Otero, a highly visible figure among Cuban dissidents, poet Amari Pacheco, and Jose Daniel Ferrer, the leader of Cuba's most important opposition group. On Saturday, the government bussed in thousands of people to Havana's seaside promenade for a mass rally in support of the regime. Similar demonstrations in which people waved tiny Cuban flags were held in a dozen cities around the island. Communist Party members, state workers, and students are required to attend government mass events. So right now in Cuba, let's say you're a college student, right? The internet is completely shut down because the only internet provider is a state-owned monopoly. So they've shut down the internet and cell service in the country. You have to wait hours to get a bus to travel, to go places. You have to wait hours to get basic food and personal items. The amount of healthcare in the country is completely diminished. The government is cracking down on people who are speaking out against the regime. People who are protesting are being arrested. People are being assaulted. The leader of the country is directly calling on his supporters to go out and physically attack the protesters and people calling for change. Prominent figures who were, opponents of this regime are being arrested and, being detained by these forces. And then on top of that, the government requires certain groups of people to actually come out and support them regardless of what happens in person. So President Biden is voicing support for the protesters, calling it a, quote, clarion call for freedom and relief. The Cuban government has responded to past crises by allowing mass immigration to the United States, but U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security Alejandro Mayorkas said that Cubans attempting to reach the U.S. by boat will not be allowed in. Mr. Diaz-Canel blames electricity outages as well as shortages of food and medicines on the U.S. embargo and the restrictions reimposed by the Trump administration that cut off Cuban access to hard currency. He is calling on the Biden administration to remove the sanctions. In Florida, home to many Cuban Americans, Republican Governor Ron DeSantis urged Mr. Biden to help provide internet to Cubans on the island, but such effort would require equipment on the ground to get the signal, and the government strictly controls imports of such equipment. Quote, we're considering whether we have the technological ability to reinstate that access, Mr. Biden said. He said his administration is considering allowing for more remittances to Cuba and sending COVID-19 vaccines, but needs assurances that the Cuban government won't take advantage of the assistance. But some good news in this entire thing, it was reported that using a US-based internet tool, 1 million Cubans were actually able to access the internet so far during this entire, internet blackout. Basically, by using a tool that circumvents the government's restriction, people were able to access the global internet once again, which I guess is some good news in this entire situation. Anyways, with that being said though, this is just kind of the updates on what's going on. Thank you guys for watching. If you did enjoy, make sure to leave a like, subscribe if you're brand new around here on the channel, follow me over on Twitter and Twitch at @SubToOptimus. Make sure to check out Shop Opti down below. And until my next video, guys, this is Optimus, talking about what's happening in Cuba and signing out.